and it's chapter 17. When visiting a property with such a checkered history as the Bickerstaff ruin, you might think it was safest to stick to daylight hours. This, the sensible option, is sadly impractical for us for a number of reasons. The first was that, after a night like we'd had, we didn't get out of bed till noon, and took much of our afternoon to prepare our supplies and ring the appropriate authorities to get access to the deserted house. The second was George's insistence on nipping down to Chesterley Records office in search of, quote, the Confessions of Mary Dulac, that old document by one of Bickerstaff's associates. George wanted to do this as soon as possible. He hoped it might give us some insight into the horror that had taken place at Bickerstaff's place all those years ago. He figured it was only a matter of time before Bobby Vernon read the same old newspapers he'd found and made precisely the same connections. The final and most important reason that we didn't get there until after sundown was me, or rather the question of my particular talents. After our chat with the skull, Lockwood's faith in these was now sky high. He told me as much as we worked in the office together, collecting equipment for our operation. There's no question about it, Luce, he said, setting out a neat row of salt bombs along the floor. Your sensitivity is phenomenal, and we've got to give you every chance to use it. Who knows what you might pick up in the Bickerstaff house after dark? And I don't mean just by listening. You could use your sense of touch as well. Yeah, I said heavily. Maybe. You might detect that I didn't speak with wild enthusiasm. It's true I can sometimes pick up impressions of the past by touching objects that possess psychic residue, but that doesn't mean it's always a pleasant thing to do. It was pretty clear that the Bickerstaff's residence was unlikely to provide me with many jolly experiences, no matter how chirpy Lockwood might be right now. I couldn't share much of his good humour that afternoon anyway. Once again, the daylight had the effect of lessening the thrill of the Whispering Skull's words, and I found myself increasingly uncomfortable that we were following a trail that he had set for us. The first things I did when I came downstairs were to close the valve in the bung and cover the jar with a cloth. I didn't want the ghost to hear us or see us unless we willed it. Even so, I couldn't help but feeling the damage had already been done. I finished emptying our work belts into the desk and began sorting through the thermometers and torches, the candles and the matchboxes, the vials of lavender water and all the rest, making sure everything was in perfect working order. Lockwood was humming peaceably to himself as he set about restocking our supplies of iron. That was the other thing about the skull. Almost in the same breath as mentioning Bickerstaff's secret papers, it made new insinuations about Lockwood's upstairs room. I turned to look out the office window into the basement yard. Iron bands across the inside of the door? There was only one reason anyone would do that. No, clearly the claim was ridiculous. Yet, how could I take one of the ghost's comments on trust and disbelieve the other? Lucy, Lockwood said. It was almost as if he'd been reading my thoughts. I've been thinking about our friend the skull. You're the only one who talks to it. You've got a sense of its personality. Why do you think it suddenly started speaking? I paused a moment before answering. I really don't know, to be honest. I don't trust anything it says. But I do think there must be something about the Bickerstaff case that attracts it. You remember when it spoke the first night after we'd got back from the cemetery? I think we'd been talking about Bickerstaff, just as we were last night. It's overheard us talk about it, dozens of other cases in the past few months, has never got involved in those before. Now it has twice in 3 days. I don't think it's a coincidence. Lockwood was filling up a canister of iron filings. He nodded slowly. You're right. We've got to tread carefully until we understand what it wants. And there was one other thing it said. It claimed that Bickerstaff's mirror, this bone glass, gives you knowledge and enlightenment. What do you think that means? Not a clue. That's what just what George has looked into the glass. Or it's just that George has looked into the glass, only briefly, of course, but still. He glanced up at me. How does he seem to you, Lucy? Do you think he's okay? He seems a bit distracted sometimes, but that's hardly new. Well, we'll keep an eye on him. He grinned. It was that warm smile that made everything seem simpler, ready to click perfectly into place. With luck, he'll bring us back some new info on Bickerstaff today. Hopefully we'll hear from Flo soon as well. If we can get word of Winkman's auction as well, that'll really put the wind in our sails. But Lockwood's enthusiasm was misplaced. Flo Bones did not appear that day, and we had to wait till almost 5 o'clock till George returned, very weary and out of sorts. There's something strange going on in Chesterdy, he said as he collapsed into a chair. I went to the records office and they confirmed that, quote, the Confessions of Mary Dulac was a real document from their archives. But when they went to get it, guess what? It was gone, stolen. They can't say when or how long ago, and there's no telling whether other copies even exist. Ah, so frustrating. Was it Bobby Vernon? I asked. Maybe he's already ahead of you. George scowled. Wrong. I'm ahead of him. He's made an appointment in Chesterdy for tomorrow. No, someone else thought this was worth stealing. Well, we'll see. I rang Albert Joplin on the way home, asked if he had any ideas about where another copy might be. He's an excellent researcher. He might be able to join us up there. Lockwood frowned. Joplin? You couldn't, or you shouldn't let anyone else know what we're up to. What if he tells Kipps? Oh, Albert's all right. He likes me. Tell you what, though, he's fallen out of sorts with Mr. Saunders. Saunders is furious about all the trouble up at Kensal Green. He's suspended operations, sent most of the night watch home without pay. Joplin's very annoyed about it. He adjusted his glasses and looked around at us. So that's my news. What's been going on back here? I spoke to Hampstead authorities, Lockwood said. The site and the Green Gates Sanatorium is still derelict, cordoned off from the rest for health reasons, but accessible from a street called Whitestone Lane. Luce, you check the A to Z. We'll get the last bus before curfew. Bickerstaff's house is on the edge of the site, open and unlocked. No keys ever required because no one in the right mind goes in there apparently. Sounds just like our sort of place, I said. Lockwood got up and stretched lazily. Well, it's that time of the afternoon. I'm going to stick a sword into Straw Woman. Then I'm off to rest. If half the stories we've heard about this house are true, it's going to be an active night. Hampstead Hill, a leafy suburb in the north of London, is a pretty genteel sort of place, at least during the hours of daylight, and if our walk that evening was anything to go by, the streets of the western edge of Hampstead Heath are the cushiest of all. Wide avenues, lined with trees and rows of ghost lamps, curve gently around the contours of the hill. Swanky properties, sprawling and detached, nestled in large gardens. Even the dusk that settled rapidly around us had a prosperous, well-fed feel. The impression was maintained for most of the way along Whitestone Lane, a short, broad cul-de-sac of heavily built mid-Victorian villas lying right on the margins of the heath. Well-kept lawns, verdant borders, rhododendrons as plump and bushy as a beggar's beard. The first few houses easily kept up the Hampstead standard. Toward the end of the road, however, things became shabbier, and the last two residences were empty and unoccupied. Beyond them, the road ended in a pair of iron gates, high and rusted, topped by rolls of barbed wire. Triangular deep-rack warning posters fringed the fluorescent orange, signalled it as a no-go zone. This was the entrance to the site of the Green Gates Sanatorium, burned down a century ago and abandoned ever since. A coil of rusted chain had been wound around the gates to secure them. There wasn't any padlock. There wasn't any need for one. With gloved hands, Lockwood began to untie the chain. The links were stiff and fused. You said they tried building a housing development here once, George, he said, but they had to abandon it because of disturbances. What was the story there? George had been staring through the gate bars into the darkness of the heath. Despite the evening's warmth, he wore a woolly jacket and a pair of fingerless gloves. He also had on his dark, high night jacket, jeans, and work boots. An extra strap laden with canisters and salt bombs was looped around his torso. To my surprise, he'd also opted for an extra large rucksack, different from the one I'd prepared for him. It was clearly heavy. His face was lined with perspiration. The usual, he said. You know the kind of thing. Lockwood pulled the chain free, pushing sharply on the metal. With a creak like bones breaking, the gates sprang open. One after another, we slipped through. George and I switched on our torches, almost directly beneath our feet. The road's fissured tarmac was swallowed under a layer of long, waving grass. Our lights danced and flitted over the uneven, lumpy ground. Here and there, tall beeches rose, and clumps of young oaks and silver birch. The line of the road curled away to the left among the trees. We followed the track to the site of the sanatorium. Or rather, we followed the track to the site of the sanatorium, George said. Half a mile, a bit higher on the hill. Lockwood nodded. Fine, we'll follow you. We went in silence, single file, legs brushing through the grasses. The last heat of the day still radiated from the earth. The moon had risen, and a cool silvered light bathed the undulating wasteland. Banks of white clouds towered over the castles in the sky. When you say the usual, George, I said finally, you mean shades? Yeah, shades and glimmers mainly, half-seen presences, dim lights floating in the air. And the sanatorium's isolated on the hill, remember? So no one wants to stay up there. Nothing too dangerous, though. Not the sanatorium ruins itself. The Bickerstaff is perhaps another matter. We climbed a little way along the contour of the hill. The lights of London stretched below us like a glittering neon sea. It was very silent. Curfew had already sounded, and the city had turned inward on itself, shutting out the night. Do you mind if we stop for a bit? George said. I need a breather. He slung his rucksack aside and collapsed upon the ground. It really was a monster pack, and the shape was odd. It was hard and curved, not blobby like you'd get with chains. What exactly have you in there, George? I said. Oh, just some extra supplies. Don't worry about me. The exercise will do me good. I stared at it, my frown deepening. Since when have you cared about? And then I knew. I recognized the shape. I strode across and flicked the rucksack top open and loosened the drawstring. I shone my torch in on the plastic bung and smoothly curving sides of the familiar silver glass jar. The skull! I cried. You brought the skull! You snuck it along with us. George looked pained. Snuck makes it sound easy. It's quite an effort, actually. I know ectoplasm technically weighs nothing, but you wouldn't think so to feel it. My poor back. And you were going to tell me this when? Well, hopefully never. It was just we didn't know exactly where Bickerstaff's study is, do we? But the skull does. And if we couldn't figure it out, Lockwood thought, what? I spun around upon our leader, who had been doing a good impression of someone utterly fascinated by a nearby patch of nettles. Lockwood, you knew about this? He cleared his throat. Well, he suggested it, George said promptly. It was his idea, which makes me think that he should be doing some of the carrying, come to mention it. I've been lugging this since Maliborn, and my poor old back. Will you shut up about your poor old back? This is crazy. You want me to talk with a dangerous Type 3 ghost inside another haunted zone, with who knows what other visitors around? Are you both mad? You expect me to agree to that? No, George said. We didn't, which is why we didn't tell you. I gave a cry of disgust. Forget it. What happened to us treading carefully, Lockwood? I've got a good mind to go back home. Please, Lucy, Lockwood said, don't overreact. It's not dangerous. We're keeping the jar inside the sack. The bung is closed, and the ghost can't affect you or communicate in any way. But we do have it for backup. So if we're stuck and unable to find these papers, papers that are almost certainly that don't exist, I growled. Don't forget we're following a clue given to us by a malicious ghost head in a jar. It's not reliable. I'm not saying it is, but since it claims to have worked with Bickerstaff, taking it back to this house might be a good way of encouraging it to speak some more. I didn't look at him. If I had, he would have given me the smile, and I wasn't in the mood for it. You're taking me for granted, I said. Me and this house. Terrible things have happened up there, Lockwood said, but that doesn't mean the place is haunted now. Bickerstaff's ghost was at the cemetery, remember? He's not here. The bone glass isn't there. Well then, what's left to harm us? He knew better than that. We all did. Things were never that simple. I didn't answer, but just shouldered my pack and set off up the path, leaving the others to follow. The trail cut in amongst the trees, leaving the London lights behind. The humps beneath the grass grew larger, and at last broke upwards into stretches of crumbled wall, most low and tangled with moss and grass, some still rising to second-story height. It was the remains of the burned sanatorium. My instincts prickled. I sensed a presence of unwelcome things. Great pale moths fluttered lazily among the ruins. I looked at them with suspicion, but they seemed natural enough. We went on, cautiously. I see death glows, Lockwood said, faint ones in the ruins. For a moment, when I listened, I thought I heard the faint, crackling flames, shouts of distinct screams. Then the sounds faded, and all I could hear was the wind sighing gently among the leaves. We walked a little further. As we passed close to the tallest remaining stretch of wall, a faint grey shape, only visible from the corner of the eye, appeared in the shadows of a broken doorway that stood there, watching us. I felt the cold brush of its attention. Type 1, Lockwood said. A shade or lurker. Nothing to worry about. What's that up there? He stopped, pointing toward the crown of the hill. That'll be it, George said. The Bickerstaff house. The building rose, stark and black, against the silvered sky, distant from the tangled mess of ruins. It was set within its own boundary wall, a large, ugly, raw-boned construction, made with awkward-looking bricks that seemed somehow out of proportion. In sunlight, I guessed it would be dark grey. The roof had many chimneys, many steeply sloping panes of slate, some of which had fallen away. I could see roof beams jutting through like ribs. There were plenty of large windows, all empty, black and watchful, the typical eyes of a deserted house. A gravel path led, ruler straight, toward the door, up the incline of the hill. The garden was overgrown, the grass high as our thighs. We stood at the gate, hands on rapier hilts, considering it coolly. George took a packet of mints from his pocket and passed them around. Well, I'll admit it looks pretty bad, Lockwood said, sucking on his mint. But since when has a house's appearance meant anything? Remember that slaughterhouse in Deptford? That was a terrible looking place, but nothing happened there. Nothing happened to you, I corrected him, because you were upstairs, hobnobbing with the owner. It was George and I who got jumped by a limbless in the basement. Oh, yes, maybe I'm thinking of somewhere else. What I mean is, we're not necessarily going to run into trouble here, despite its history of violent death. Pass us another mint, would you, George? As reassuring speeches went, I'd still heard better. Anyway, Lockwood Co. hadn't earned its city-wide reputation by dawdling outside haunted houses. That wasn't why Barnes had put us on this case. That wasn't why we were going to beat Kipps to the solution. Come to think of it, it wasn't why Penelope Fitz had invited us to her party. Squaring our shoulders, we set off up the path. Just remember, Lockwood said, cheerfully breaking the night's silence and disturbing our morbid thoughts. We've got two sets of objectives here. We look for these papers that the skull mentioned, and we try to pick up any psychic traces left by Bickerstaff and his friends. Simple, clean, efficient. We go straight in and we come straight out. Easy. There won't be any problems. We halted at the end of the path. I contemplated the mouldering steps, the wonky door, and the shutters hanging askew against the broken windows. The little weather-beaten demons carved into the spiral pillars on either side of the porch. It has to be said, I didn't wholly share his confidence. There was a strong, sweet scent coming from a climbing shrub that choked one wall. The air was warm and close. George had pattered up the steps. He squinted through the grimy bottle glass window beside the door. I can't see anything, he said. Who's going in first? That'll be Lucy, Lockwood said. I frowned. Again? It's always me. No, it isn't. I did Mrs. Bartlett, didn't I? George did the iron coffin. Yes, but before that No arguments, Luce. You're in the hot seat tonight. Don't worry, we'll be right behind you. Besides, like I say, with any luck there'll be nothing dangerous there. Just psychic traces and memories. Which is precisely what a visitor is, Lockwood. An aggressive psychic memory. Oh, very well. Why can't we ever do this at a more sensible time? Like noon? I knew the answer to that, of course. It's only after dark that you can detect the faint and hidden things. Only after dark do a house's memories begin to stir. I pushed at the door, expecting to be warped shut, or locked, or both, but it was none of those. The door opened soundlessly, unleashing stale air and a preserved smell of decay. And I have to say, my skin did crawl a little as I stood there, and the hairs on my neck did rise. Maybe Lockwood was right. Maybe the place would be free of actual visitors, but but this was a house where the previous proprietor had engaged in years of sinister occult research, where he'd probably tried to summon the spirits of the dead in a series of unsavory experiments, and where he'd suffered a mysterious and solitary death. Let's face it, we were talking about trace memories that would need more than a squirt of air freshener to remove. Still, I'm an agent, etc., etc., you know the deal. Without much hesitation, I stepped inside. And that's the end of that chapter. Thanks for bearing with me on that one. Do you know what it is? There's a watch. We got not smart watch, one of those exercise watches, and it keeps buzzing, and it's been scaring the life out of me every couple of minutes. I don't know, you might be able to hear it faintly, but it's buzzing against the wood, and it's driving me crackers. Where is it even? Oh, I'll have to have a look for it. Oh, there it is. It's been there, it buzzed again. Right, that's it. That's going in the other room. Thanks for listening. I'll get this uploaded for you. I'll see you next time.